It was meant to be a hero's final farewell. Marcus Ellison had bled for this country, earning a Silver Star in the brutal jungles of Vietnam. But on the day of his burial, his grieving family found their path blocked by flashing red and blue lights. A local cop with a long-standing vendetta decided a black veteran didn't deserve a police escort or a peaceful procession. He thought he held all the power in that small town. He had absolutely no idea an entire platoon was already marching down the highway. The town of Fairview, Tennessee was the kind of place where history didn't just linger in the air. It suffocated. It was a town of old money, old families, and old prejudices that had merely been painted over with the thin veneer of modern polite society. For Marcus Ellison, Fairview was both home and a lifelong battlefield. Marcus was a man carved from mahogany and quiet resilience. He had served his country in the United States Army, deploying during the Vietnam War with the 1st Cavalry Division. In the sweltering, unforgiving nightmare of the Ia Drang Valley, Marcus had carried 4 wounded men out of a hot landing zone while under heavy enemy fire. He took shrapnel in his shoulder and a bullet through his left thigh, earning a Purple Heart and a Silver Star for his unmatched valor. When he returned home after the war, there were no parades for him. There was no key to the city. Instead, he returned to a town where he was still expected to step off the sidewalk when certain people walked past. But Marcus never complained. He took a job at the local steel mill, worked double shifts, raised a beautiful daughter named Lila, and kept his medals locked away in a scuffed wooden cigar box. He was a pillar of his community, a man who would fix a neighbor's roof for free or press his last $20 bill into the hands of a struggling widow. Marcus lived a long, full life until his heart finally gave out on a quiet evening. The loss sent a shockwave through the eastern side of Fairview. His daughter, Lila, was left to pick up the pieces. Lila was a schoolteacher, possessing her father's iron will and gentle eyes. Over several days, she tirelessly arranged a funeral that would finally give her father the honor his hometown had denied him in life. She coordinated with the local VFW post, ensuring that the American flag would drape his polished oak casket. She arranged for a military chaplain, Reverend Silas Crow, to deliver the eulogy. But Lila also knew the realities of Fairview. She knew the local police department, specifically an officer named Derek Harlan. Officer Harlan was a third-generation law enforcement officer in Fairview, and he wore his badge less like a shield and more like a crown. He was a man deeply infected with the town's oldest hatreds. For years, Harlan had made it his personal mission to harass Marcus. It started with petty traffic stops, fictitious broken taillights, failing to signal exactly 100 feet before a turn, noise complaints when Marcus was simply running his lawnmower at noon on a Saturday. Harlan couldn't stand the sight of Marcus's straight-backed dignity. He hated the way Marcus looked him in the eye, never shrinking, never trembling. As Lila stood in the dimly lit parlor of the Henderson Funeral Home that morning, smoothing the crisp fabric of her father's dress uniform inside the casket, she felt a knot tightening in her stomach. The oppressive summer heat was already pressing against the frosted glass windows. "He looks peaceful, Lila," whispered Elias Bennett, a Korean War veteran and Marcus's oldest friend. Elias was slated to drive the hearse today. "He does, Uncle Elias," Lila replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I just want today to go smoothly. I just want him to rest. We've got the route planned, straight down Route 9 across the county line to Willow Creek Memorial. It's a straight shot, nothing to worry about." Elias reassured her, patting her shoulder with a trembling, age-spotted hand. That morning, the procession was lined up behind the sleek black hearse. There were nearly 40 cars, friends, family, people whose lives Marcus had touched over the decades. They turned their headlights on, a shimmering river of grief, preparing to escort a hero to his final resting place. Lila sat in the passenger seat of the lead limousine, clutching her father's dog tags in her palm. The metal was warm against her skin. The procession slowly pulled out of the funeral home parking lot, the tires crunching over the gravel. For the initial stretch, there was only the solemn silence of the grieving caravan. The trees lining the two-lane highway created a canopy of green, filtering the harsh summer sun. But as they approached the intersection of Route 9 and Miller's Crossing, the exact border between the municipal town limits and the county jurisdiction, the canopy broke. And there, sitting sideways across the double yellow line, was a Fairview Police Department cruiser. The light bar on the roof was blazing, slicing through the morning heat with violent, blinding flashes of red and blue. Lila's heart dropped into her stomach. Leaning against the hood of the cruiser, his arms crossed over his chest, and a pair of mirrored aviator sunglasses hiding his eyes, was Officer Derek Harlan. Elias Bennett gently pressed the brakes, bringing the heavy black hearse to a smooth stop about 20 yards from the police cruiser. The line of cars behind them rippled to a halt, a collective wave of confusion washing over the mourners. "What is this?" Elias muttered, his grip tightening on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "There hasn't been a traffic accident. The road is clear behind him." Lila didn't wait. A fierce, protective anger flared in her chest, briefly overriding her profound grief. She opened the door of the limousine and stepped out onto the blistering asphalt. The humidity wrapped around her black morning dress like a wet blanket, but she walked forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Elias quickly shifted the hearse into park and scrambled out to follow her, his old joints popping. Officer Harlan didn't move from his casual lean against his cruiser. He simply chewed his gum, a slow, methodical grind of his jaw, watching Lila approach. He was a heavy-set man, his uniform shirt stretching at the buttons, a thin film of sweat shining on his forehead beneath his peaked cap. "Officer Harlan," Lila said, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "Is there a problem? We are in a funeral procession for my father, Marcus Ellison. We need to get to Willow Creek." Harlan slowly pushed himself off the hood of his car. He unhooked his thumbs from his heavy-duty belt and took a few deliberate steps toward Lila, looking past her to the hearse, then back to her. "Morning, Lila," Harlan drawled, making no effort to remove his sunglasses or lower his voice. "I'm afraid you folks are going to have to turn this parade around." "Parade?" Lila repeated, her eyes widening in disbelief. "This is a funeral procession. The cemetery is only a short distance down this road." "I know where the cemetery is," Harlan snapped, his tone instantly losing its mock politeness. "What I don't know is who gave you permission to shut down a municipal roadway. You got a permit for a motorcade?" Elias Bennett stepped up beside Lila, his voice shaking with indignation. "A permit? You don't need a permit for a funeral procession in Fairview, Derek Harlan, and you know it. I've driven this hearse for years. We have our hazard lights on. We have our headlights on. We have the right of way." Harlan shifted his gaze to the elderly man, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Watch your tone with me, old man. City Ordinance 402, Section B. Any gathering of vehicles exceeding 15 cars traveling in a coordinated fashion requires a municipal permit to ensure traffic safety. I count at least 40 cars back there. You're creating a public hazard." "A hazard?" Lila's voice rose, echoing off the trees. "There is no traffic out here. You deliberately parked across the road to stop my father's funeral. You harassed him while he was alive, and now you won't even let him be buried in peace." "Dina." Harlan's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. He stepped directly into Lila's personal space, towering over her. "Listen to me very carefully. I don't care who is in that wooden box. Law is the law. You do not have a permit. So you can either order all these cars to turn around and disperse, or I will start issuing citations. And if you refuse to move this hearse, I will impound the driver, impound the vehicle, and tow it." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Impound the hearse with her father's body inside. Behind them, car doors were opening. Relatives and friends were stepping out into the heat, trying to see what the holdup was. Whispers rippled down the line. "Is it an accident? Why is the police blocking the hearse?" Reverend Silas Crow, dressed in his clerical collar, hurried up to the front, wiping sweat from his brow. "Officer, please," the Reverend pleaded, his hands raised in a placating gesture. This is a decorated war veteran, a man of God. We are merely trying to lay him to rest. Can you not find it in your heart to let us pass? We will be out of your jurisdiction very soon." "Step back, Reverend," Harlan warned, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his sidearm, an intimidation tactic he used effortlessly. "I told them the options. Turn around or go to jail." "We can't turn around," Lila cried out, tears of absolute frustration finally breaking free. "The burial is scheduled soon. The honor guard is waiting at the cemetery. You are doing this out of spite." "That's it," Harlan barked. He pulled a heavy radio from his shoulder mic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I have an unlawful assembly at the county line on Route 9, requesting 2 additional units for traffic control and possible detainment, and get me a flatbed tow truck out here immediately." The radio crackled back. "Copy, Unit 4. Unit 7 and 9 are en route." Lila looked at the casket, visible through the large glass windows of the hearse. The American flag was draped beautifully over the polished wood. Her father had survived bullet and shrapnel and the absolute horrors of war, only to be held hostage on a blistering asphalt road by a man who had never sacrificed a single thing in his life. The standoff stretched into a grueling ordeal. For what felt like an eternity, the procession sat baking in the sweltering heat. The elderly mourners in the cars behind the hearse were struggling. Some had to keep their engines running for air conditioning, burning through gas. Others in older vehicles had to roll their windows down and fan themselves with funeral programs, the thick, humid air providing no relief. Lila refused to move. She stood directly in front of the hearse, acting as a human shield between Officer Harlan and her father's body. Elias Bennett stood rigidly beside her, his jaw set. He was not going to abandon his post. 2 more Fairview police cruisers arrived, their sirens wailing unnecessarily loudly as they pulled up behind Harlan's car, forming an impenetrable wall of law enforcement. 2 younger officers, Officer Lang and Officer Pierce, stepped out. They looked slightly uncomfortable when they saw the hearse and the grieving family, but they fell in line behind Harlan without a word. The toxic culture of the department demanded absolute loyalty to the badge, right or wrong. "Time's up," Harlan announced, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink was deafening in the heavy silence of the road. He pointed directly at Elias Bennett. "Step away from the vehicle, sir. You're under arrest for obstructing a public roadway and failing to comply with a lawful order." "No!" Leela screamed, stepping in front of Elias. "You can't do this. He hasn't done anything." Harlan's eyes narrowed. "I'll arrest you too, Lila. Don't think I won't. Obstruction of justice looks real bad on a schoolteacher's record." Several younger men from the procession, Marcus's nephews and cousins, began jogging up from the back of the line. Their faces were tight with fury. Seeing the officer brandishing handcuffs at a grieving woman and an elderly man was the breaking point. "Hey, get your hands off her!" yelled David, Marcus's nephew, stepping forward. Harlan instantly unclipped his taser, aiming the yellow device squarely at David's chest. The other 2 officers dropped their hands to their holstered firearms. "Back up!" Harlan roared, spit flying from his lips. "All of you back to your vehicles. This is now an active crime scene." Lila threw her arms out desperately, trying to push her family members back. She knew exactly what Harlan wanted. He wanted an excuse. He wanted a reason to escalate, to turn her father's solemn memorial into a violent spectacle. "David, stop. Everyone stay back. Please don't give him what he wants," she pleaded, her voice cracking. The situation was a powder keg, a fraction of an inch from exploding. Harlan stepped forward aggressively, grabbing Elias Bennett by the shoulder and spinning the old man around. Elias winced in pain, his fragile shoulder popping under the brutal force. "Uncle Elias!" Lila cried, grabbing Harlan's wrist. "That's assaulting an officer!" Harlan yelled triumphantly. He let go of Elias and violently shoved Lila backward. She stumbled in her heels, falling hard onto the searing asphalt. Her knees scraped against the gravel, drawing blood, and the funeral program she had been clutching fluttered away in the hot breeze. A collective gasp of horror and outrage erupted from the mourners. David lunged forward, but Reverend Silas Crowe grabbed him, holding him back with a desperate Herculean strength. Harlan stood over Lila, breathing heavily, entirely consumed by his own petty, tyrannical power. "Hands behind your back, Lila. You're going to jail." He reached down to grab her, but before his fingers could make contact, a sound pierced the heavy summer air. At first it was just a low vibration, a subtle trembling in the asphalt beneath Lila's bleeding knees. Then it grew into a deep, rhythmic, mechanical thunder. It wasn't the sound of civilian cars. It was the heavy guttural roar of massive diesel engines. Harlan paused, looking up, his brow furrowing. The two younger officers turned around, peering down the road behind them past the county line marker. Coming down Route 9 from the direction of Willow Creek Cemetery was a massive convoy. Leading the pack was not a police car, but a flat, dark, olive-drab military Humvee. Its headlights were blazing, and a large, bright American flag flapped violently from an antenna on the rear. Behind the Humvee came a massive armored troop transport truck, followed by 36 rumbling customized motorcycles, driven by men wearing black leather vests adorned with military patches. The earth literally shook as the convoy bore down on the police blockade. Harlan let go of his handcuffs, taking a step back. His arrogant smirk melted into a mask of pure confusion. The convoy didn't slow down as it approached the 3 police cruisers. It kept coming, massive and unyielding, right up to the very edge of the county line, stopping mere inches from the side of Harlan's parked cruiser. The engines of the motorcycles roared in a deafening unison, drowning out the police radios, drowning out the sirens, drowning out the suffocating prejudice of Fairview, Tennessee. The doors of the Humvee swung open. Stepping out into the blinding summer sun was a towering figure in a perfectly pressed, immaculately decorated United States Army Class A uniform. He wore the silver bars of a first lieutenant. His chest was heavy with ribbons. His face was weathered, sharp and intensely furious. This was retired First Lieutenant Elias Thorne. Decades ago, in a valley of death in Vietnam, a black soldier named Marcus Ellison had carried a bleeding, broken Elias Thorne through enemy territory. Marcus had saved his life, and Elias Thorne had not come to Fairview alone. He had brought the entire surviving brotherhood of the 1st Cavalry and a few hundred friends. The doors of the troop transport trucks slammed open, and dozens of men, veterans of Vietnam, Desert Storm, and Afghanistan, some in crisp uniforms, others in suits, all bearing the rigid, unyielding posture of soldiers, began pouring out onto the road. Harlan's face went completely pale. The true standoff had just begun. The deafening roar of the Harley-Davidsons and heavy diesel engines abruptly cut off, leaving a ringing silence in the humid summer air. The dust kicked up by the massive convoy drifted over the county line like smoke across a battlefield. First Lieutenant Elias Thorne did not walk. He marched. Even at an advanced age, his spine was a steel rod, his shoulders squared to the world. Every step he took toward the flashing lights of the Fairview police cruisers was deliberate, his polished black dress shoes striking the pavement with military precision. Behind him, a sea of men moved in silent, synchronized support. There were over 60 of them. Some wore the iconic leather vests of the Patriot Guard Riders, an organization of motorcyclists dedicated to shielding the funerals of fallen heroes from protests and disruptions. Others were members of Marcus's old unit, the 1st Cavalry, wearing their combat patch jackets, crisp garrison caps, and an array of medals that caught the harsh midday sun. Officer Derek Harlan's hand froze midair, hovering just inches from Lila's arm. The blood drained from his face, leaving his cheeks a pasty, mottled gray. He took a stumbling step backward, his boots scraping clumsily against the asphalt. The 2 younger officers, Lang and Pierce, reflexively took their hands off their holstered weapons, suddenly realizing how profoundly outmatched they were. Lieutenant Thorne ignored Harlan entirely. He walked straight past the trembling officer, his icy blue eyes locked onto Lila, who was still kneeling on the searing pavement, with scraped and bleeding knees. Thorne knelt with a grace that defied his age. He took a crisp white linen handkerchief from his breast pocket and gently pressed it to Lila's bleeding knee. "You must be Lila," Thorne said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded instant respect. "Your father showed me a picture of you when you were just a little girl. He carried it in his helmet liner, right next to a four-leaf clover." Lila looked up at the towering, decorated soldier, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Who are you?" "I'm the man who gets to breathe today, because your father didn't know the meaning of the word retreat," Thorne replied softly. He extended a strong, calloused hand and helped Lila to her feet. He then turned his attention to Elias Bennett, offering the elderly driver a sharp, respectful nod. "At ease, Corporal Bennett. We'll take the watch from here." Thorne finally turned slowly to face Officer Harlan. The transition in his demeanor was instantaneous and terrifying. The warmth vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating glare of a combat commander assessing a hostile threat. "Now," Thorne said, his voice carrying clearly over the idling engines of the police cruisers, "who is the commanding officer of this pathetic excuse for a roadblock?" Harlan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He puffed out his chest, desperately trying to summon his shattered authority. "I am Officer Derek Harlan, Fairview Police, and you people are interfering with an active police investigation. This is an illegal assembly. You all need to turn your vehicles around and clear the county line right now." Thorne didn't blink. He simply stared down at Harlan, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating. Behind Thorne, the Patriot Guard riders moved. Without a single order being shouted, 30 large, heavily bearded men stepped forward in perfect unison. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't shout insults. They simply formed a solid human wall between the Fairview police cruisers and the hearse containing Marcus Ellison. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their arms crossed, staring silently down at the three officers. Their leather vests bore the patches of conflict spanning 5 decades: Vietnam, Grenada, Desert Storm, Fallujah. It was a wall of American history, and it was entirely immovable. "I asked you a question, Officer Harlan," Thorne said quietly, stepping so close that Harlan could see the reflection of his own panicked face in the buttons of Thorne's uniform. "You put your hands on a grieving daughter. You assaulted a veteran of the Korean War. And you are attempting to hold the remains of an American hero hostage over a fabricated municipal permit." "It's not fabricated," Harlan stammered, his voice cracking an octave higher than normal. "City Ordinance 402. They crossed the line of a coordinated motorcade. I have a tow truck on the way, and if you don't back off, I will arrest every single one of you for obstructing a public servant." A low collective chuckle rumbled through the line of veterans. It wasn't a sound of amusement. It was the sound of apex predators looking at trapped prey. "You aren't arresting anyone, son," said a voice from the crowd. A man with a thick white beard and a prosthetic leg stepped forward. He wore a faded green boonie hat. "Because you're standing on the wrong side of the asphalt." Harlan looked down at his boots. In his arrogant haste to block the road, he had parked his cruiser diagonally. The front tires of his car and Harlan's own 2 feet were planted exactly across the painted white line that marked the end of Fairview's municipal limits and the beginning of the county jurisdiction. "You have absolutely zero authority where your boots are currently planted, Officer Harlan," Thorne stated, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You are outside your city limits. You are attempting to enforce a city ordinance on a county highway. And the men standing in front of you do not answer to small-town bullies." Just then, a heavy diesel engine roared up from behind the long line of mourners' cars. A massive yellow flatbed tow truck ground its gears, squeezing past the procession and coming to a halt near the police cruisers. Harlan's eyes lit up with desperate relief. "Finally," he muttered. He waved his hand at the tow truck driver. "Roy, get the rig over here. Hook up the black hearse. We're impounding it." The driver of the tow truck, a burly man named Roy Wyatt, wearing a grease-stained ball cap, stepped out of the cab. He took one look at the situation: the weeping daughter, the hearse draped in an American flag, and the 60 silent, stone-faced veterans, forming an impenetrable barricade. Roy walked over to the side of his truck, leaned against the heavy winch, and pulled a toothpick from his pocket. He looked at Harlan, shook his head slowly, and spat onto the asphalt. "I ain't hooking up a dead soldier, Derek," Roy said, his voice echoing loudly in the tense silence. "And I sure as hell ain't hooking up a hearse with 50 angry veterans standing around it. You're out of your mind." "I'm giving you a lawful order, Wyatt," Harlan screamed, his composure completely disintegrating. "Hook up the vehicle or I will revoke your city towing contract." "Revoke it." Roy shrugged, climbing back up into the cab of his truck. "I'd rather go bankrupt than be the man who towed a hero's casket so a local cop could feel like a big man. You're on your own, Harlan." The tow truck shifted into reverse, slowly backing away down the shoulder of the highway, leaving Harlan completely isolated. The departure of the tow truck shattered the last remnants of Harlan's illusion of control. He was standing outside his jurisdiction, outmanned, outmaneuvered, and publicly humiliated. Yet the toxic pride that had fueled his decades of racism and harassment refused to let him surrender. "Dispatch!" Harlan yelled into his shoulder radio, his voice frantic. "I need the chief out here. I need SWAT. We have a hostile armed militia interfering with police operations at the county line." The radio hissed with static, but before the dispatcher could reply, a new sound cut through the muggy air. It was a siren, but not the high-pitched wail of the Fairview municipal cruisers. It was the deep, authoritative growl of a heavy-duty county interceptor. Coming from the Willow Creek side of the highway behind the military convoy, a dark brown Ford Explorer SUV tore down the center line, its roof illuminated with flashing red and clear strobes. The SUV screeched to a halt right next to Lieutenant Thorne's Humvee. The door swung open, and out stepped Sheriff Victor Lang. Sheriff Lang was a legend in the county. A former United States Marine who had served in Fallujah, he was a massive man with a thick gray mustache, wearing a perfectly pressed tan uniform and a wide-brimmed Stetson. Lang governed the county with an iron but deeply fair fist. He despised corruption, and he harbored a well-known intense distaste for the good old boy network that infected the Fairview Police Department. Lang adjusted his duty belt, closing the heavy car door behind him. He took off his sunglasses and surveyed the scene. He saw Lila Ellison bleeding and crying. He saw the elderly Elias Bennett rubbing his bruised shoulder. He saw the line of veterans. And finally, he locked eyes with Derek Harlan. Lieutenant Thorne offered the sheriff a sharp, respectful salute. Sheriff Lang returned the salute immediately. "Lieutenant Thorne, I apologize for the delay. Traffic on the interstate." "Not a problem, Sheriff," Thorne replied smoothly. "We were just having a disagreement about municipal geography." Lang began walking slowly toward the county line. The Patriot Guard riders parted seamlessly to let the sheriff through. Lang stopped directly opposite Harlan, their boot tips mere inches apart, separated only by the faded white paint of the boundary line. "Morning, Derek," Lang said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Sheriff Lang," Harlan said, trying to stand taller, though he was still inches shorter than the broad-shouldered Marine. "This is a municipal matter. These people are violating city ordinances. They don't have a permit for a motorcade." Lang looked past Harlan at the long line of cars, then at the hearse. He pulled a folded piece of heavy parchment paper from his breast pocket and slowly uncreased it. "That's funny, Derek, because according to this document here, signed by a county judge earlier this morning, the family of Marcus Ellison has been granted a full, unrestricted county escort to Willow Creek Cemetery. Furthermore, seeing as you are currently standing on county asphalt in my jurisdiction, enforcing a city law that does not exist here, I'd say you're the one obstructing traffic." Harlan's jaw dropped. They drove through Fairview without a permit. The infraction started in my town." "And they are in my town now," Lang growled, leaning forward so completely that Harlan had to lean back to avoid touching him. "Marcus Ellison was 10 times the man you will ever be, Harlan. And the fact that you decided to use your badge to harass his grieving daughter on the day of his burial tells me everything I ever needed to know about your character. You can't talk to me like that. I'm a sworn officer." "You are a disgrace to that uniform," Lang suddenly roared, his voice booming like a cannon shot, startling the younger Fairview officers behind Harlan. "You are a petty, vindictive little man who uses a piece of tin to hide his own cowardice. Now you listen to me, and you listen real close. You have exactly 30 seconds to get your vehicle out of the county intersection. If you do not move it, I will arrest you for disturbing the peace, reckless endangerment, and felony obstruction of a funeral procession, and I will personally put the cuffs on you." The absolute authority in Lang's voice left no room for debate. Harlan looked to his 2 younger officers for support, but Lang and Pierce had already opened the doors to their cruisers, refusing to make eye contact with him. They were done. Harlan's face burned with a humiliating, impotent rage. He looked at Lila, then at Thorne, and finally at Sheriff Lang. With shaking hands, he unclipped his radio. "Unit 4, clearing the scene." He turned on his heel, practically sprinting back to his cruiser. He threw the car into drive, the tires squealing in a cloud of acrid white smoke as he recklessly pulled the car off the road and onto the muddy shoulder, clearing the path. A profound collective sigh of relief washed over the mourners. Leela buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the adrenaline finally left her system. Lieutenant Thorne placed a comforting hand on her back. "It's over, Lila," Thorne said gently. "It's time to take him home." Sheriff Lang turned to the veterans. "Gentlemen, the road to Willow Creek is yours." But Lieutenant Thorne didn't move toward the vehicles. He looked down at the hearse, then looked back at his men. He raised his hand, signaling the crowd. "Listen up," Thorne shouted, his command voice carrying down the line. "Marcus Ellison didn't ride into the Iadrang Valley. He walked, and he walked out carrying his brothers. We are not driving the rest of the way." A cheer went up from the veterans, a fierce primal sound that echoed off the trees. Thorne turned to Elias Bennett. "Corporal Bennett, put the hearse in neutral." Elias looked confused for a moment, then a wide, tearful smile broke across his weathered face. He nodded, climbed into the driver's seat, and shifted the heavy transmission into neutral, leaving the engine off. 6 men, Lieutenant Thorne and 5 other combat veterans from Marcus's old unit, stepped up to the sides of the black hearse. They placed their hands on the polished steel of the vehicle. Behind them, the Patriot Guard riders left their motorcycles on the side of the road and fell into formation, creating a massive walking honor guard flanking the hearse on all sides. "Lila," Thorne said softly, offering his arm. "Walk with us." Lila wiped her eyes, standing tall. She linked her arm through the lieutenant's. "Forward march," Thorne commanded. Slowly, with the synchronized, agonizingly beautiful rhythm of a military funeral, the veterans began to push the hearse by hand. They pushed the multi-ton vehicle forward, the tires rolling silently over the asphalt, crossing the county line and leaving the bigotry of Fairview behind them. They walked in the blistering heat step by step, honoring a man who had given everything, accompanied by a brotherhood that never forgot its own. The sheer staggering weight of a custom-built Cadillac hearse is immense. To push it on a flat surface is a feat of tremendous exertion. To push it over the rolling uneven asphalt of Route 9 in the suffocating peak of a Tennessee summer was a grueling physical punishment. But the men surrounding Marcus Ellison's casket did not flinch. They were soldiers. They knew the intimate, agonizing cost of carrying a brother home. Lieutenant Elias Thorne took the front left quarter panel, his pristine Class A uniform jacket instantly blooming with dark patches of sweat. Next to him was a man named Gregory Thomas, a former combat medic who had lost 2 fingers to a mortar shell during the Tet Offensive. Behind them were the Patriot Guard riders, men in heavy leather vests who dug their steel-toed boots into the blistering pavement, their massive arms corded with straining muscle. They rotated in shifts of 6. Every short distance, without a single command being shouted, a new group of men would seamlessly step in, placing their calloused hands against the polished black steel of the hearse, allowing the exhausted men to fall back and catch their breath. They moved in a perfectly silent, rhythmic cadence. The only sounds for miles were the heavy synchronized thud of military boots on the road, the low mechanical hum of the hearse's tires, and the ragged, determined breathing of old men refusing to surrender to their own age. Lila walked proudly at the very front of the procession, her arms still tightly looped through Lieutenant Thorne's. The scrapes on her knees stung fiercely, the blood having dried into cracked, painful lines, but she barely felt them. A profound, overwhelming sense of awe had replaced her fear and grief. She looked back over her shoulder at the sea of veterans, a moving fortress of honor surrounding her father. For the first time in her life, she saw her father not just as the quiet, hard-working man who fixed neighbors' roofs and packed her school lunches, but as the titan these men knew him to be. As they crossed the halfway mark, the suffocating humidity finally broke the atmosphere. The sky above Fairview bruised a sudden, violent shade of purple. The cicadas in the bordering woods went dead silent. A crack of thunder rattled the teeth in their skulls, and then the heavens tore open. It wasn't a gentle summer shower. It was a torrential, blinding downpour. The rain fell in heavy sheets, instantly soaking the mourners to the bone. The water hit the blistering asphalt, sending up a thick, suffocating layer of steam. "Lieutenant!" shouted Sheriff Victor Lang, whose county cruiser was slowly idling behind the procession, its hazard lights blinking through the gray deluge. The sheriff ran up with a large black umbrella, offering it to Lila. "Get in the cruiser, Lila. You men need to take cover. The road is getting too slick." "No," Lila said, her voice surprisingly loud over the roar of the rain. Her black dress was clinging to her skin, her hair plastered against her cheeks, but she didn't break her stride. She looked up at the older officer next to her. "We don't stop. My father wouldn't have stopped." Lieutenant Thorne smiled, a fierce, prideful expression cutting through the rainwater streaming down his weathered face. He looked at Sheriff Lang and shook his head. "The young lady gave the order, Sheriff. The infantry doesn't stop for a little water." The veterans didn't seek shelter. In fact, the rain seemed to galvanize them. Several of the Patriot Guard riders shrugged off their heavy leather coats, laying them gently over the hood and roof of the hearse to protect the flag-draped casket inside from the worst of the storm. They locked their jaws, dug their boots into the slick, treacherous asphalt, and pushed harder. Word of the unprecedented march had spread rapidly through the county. As the procession slogged through the final stretch, an incredible scene began to unfold along the shoulders of Route 9. People were pulling their cars over, braving the torrential rain to stand by the side of the road. An older white woman named Martha Sullivan, who ran the local bakery and whose son Marcus had tutored in math years prior, stood knee-deep in the muddy grass, holding her hand over her heart as the hearse rolled past. A group of local volunteer firefighters parked their engine on an overpass, standing in full turnout gear and offering crisp, sustained salutes as the veterans pushed the heavy vehicle beneath them. The town of Fairview was watching. The quiet majority, the people who had tolerated the systemic ugly prejudices of men like Officer Harlan for years out of fear or apathy, were finally seeing the stark, undeniable contrast between a petty tyrant and true American heroes. By the time the sprawling wrought iron gates of Willow Creek Cemetery finally came into view through the gray haze of the rain, the procession had grown. Dozens of civilians had silently fallen into line behind the long trail of mourners' cars, walking in the rain out of sheer respect. The hearse's tires finally left the unforgiving pavement, crunching softly onto the pristine white gravel of the cemetery's main avenue. The rain began to slow, tapering off into a gentle, misty drizzle. The dark storm clouds fractured, allowing a single brilliant shaft of late-morning sunlight to pierce through the canopy of ancient weeping willows, illuminating the vibrant red, white, and blue of the flag draped over Marcus's casket. They had made it. They had carried him home. The burial plot was situated on a gentle green hill overlooking a tranquil, glass-still pond. The veterans, completely soaked, exhausted, and covered in road grime, formed two immaculate, rigid lines leading from the back of the hearse to the open earth. 6 active-duty soldiers, sent by the local army base as an official honor guard, stepped forward. They moved with absolute flawless precision, sliding the heavy oak casket from the back of the hearse and carrying it to the mechanical lowering device hovering over the grave. Reverend Silas Crow took his place at the head of the casket. His Bible was waterlogged, the pages sticking together, but he didn't need to read from it. He looked out over the massive crowd, over 200 people standing in the wet grass, united by a singular, breathtaking display of respect. In the Gospel of John it is written, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends," Reverend Crow began, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed, damp air. Marcus Ellison lived those words. In the jungles of a foreign land and on the quiet, often difficult streets of his own hometown, he bore the unbearable weight of this world with a quiet grace. Today the world tried to put one final obstacle in his path. But look around you. Look at the love that rose up to move that mountain. When the Reverend finished his prayers, the sharp authoritative voice of the honor guard commander rang out. "Detail, attention!" 3 riflemen standing perfectly silhouetted against the clearing sky raised their M14 rifles to their shoulders. Crack, crack, crack. The 21-gun salute echoed like thunderclaps across the rolling hills of the cemetery, startling a flock of blackbirds into the sky. Then a lone bugler, standing under a distant oak tree, raised a polished brass horn to his lips. The haunting, mournful notes of taps drifted over the crowd. Lila finally broke down. The sheer emotional weight of the day, the fear, the rage, the march, the absolute triumph, crashed down on her all at once. She wept openly, her Uncle Elias holding her tightly. The honor guard stepped forward, moving in a synchronized, mesmerizing ballet of respect as they lifted the flag from the casket. They folded it crisply, tucking the red and white stripes beneath the blue field of stars until it formed a perfect, unyielding triangle. The honor guard commander performed a sharp-facing movement, walking over to Lieutenant Thorne and passing the flag to the decorated veteran. Thorne took the flag, his hands trembling slightly, and walked over to Lila. He knelt slowly in the wet grass before her, holding the folded colors out with both hands. "On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation," Thorne recited, his voice thick with emotion. "Please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your father's honorable and faithful service." He paused, looking Lila directly in the eyes. "And on behalf of a young lieutenant who got to live a full life because of him, thank you." Lila took the heavy cotton flag, pressing it against her chest. "Thank you, Lieutenant, for everything." The casket was slowly lowered into the earth. Marcus Ellison was finally at peace. But for Officer Derek Harlan, the nightmare was just beginning. Harlan believed that by retreating to his jurisdiction, he had survived the encounter. He assumed that Sheriff Lang's threats were simply hot air, and that the good old boy network of Fairview would shield him from any real consequences, just as it had for years. He was catastrophically wrong. While the veterans had been pushing the hearse, a young, disgusted Officer Pierce, one of the 2 backup officers Harlan had called to the scene, had been sitting in his idling cruiser. Pierce had witnessed the entire sickening display. He had watched Harlan assault an elderly man and shove Lila to the ground, and crucially, Pierce had left his vehicle's dashcam recording the entire time. Before his shift ended that afternoon, Officer Pierce bypassed his own corrupt police chief and drove straight to the county courthouse. He handed the encrypted memory card directly to Sheriff Victor Lang. By the next morning, the video had been leaked to the local news stations by an anonymous source within the courthouse. The footage of a smirking, arrogant police officer drawing a taser on a grieving family, pushing a weeping woman to the ground, and trying to tow a flag-draped hearse played on a continuous, inescapable loop across every television screen in the state. The public outcry was instantaneous and utterly deafening. The next morning, Harlan walked into the Fairview Police Department precinct, fully expecting to ride out the storm at his desk. Instead, he found his locker completely emptied, the contents dumped into a cardboard box sitting on the floor. Standing in the center of the precinct bullpen was Sheriff Victor Lang, accompanied by 2 stern-faced men in dark suits. They were special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, operating under the authority of federal prosecutor Silas Grant. "Derek Harlan," Sheriff Lang said, his voice echoing off the linoleum floors. "Take off your duty belt." Harlan froze, his face draining of color. "Victor, come on. The media is just spinning this. You know how it is." "I am not your friend, and I am not interested in your excuses," Lang interrupted, stepping forward. "Take off the badge. Now." Trembling, Harlan unclipped his radio, unbuckled his heavy leather belt, and placed it on a nearby desk. He unpinned the silver shield from his chest, his fingers fumbling in panic. One of the FBI agents stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his waist. "Derek Harlan, you are under arrest for violating Title 18 United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. You're also being charged with felony assault, official oppression, and filing a false police report regarding a non-existent armed militia." Harlan was spun around, his hands shoved roughly behind his back. The sharp clink of the handcuffs echoing in the silent precinct was the exact sound he had so arrogantly subjected others to for years. As he was marched out the front doors of the precinct in cuffs, a crowd of over 300 Fairview residents, including Martha Sullivan and dozens of people who had stood in the rain for Marcus Ellison, were waiting on the sidewalk. They didn't shout. They didn't riot. They just watched in profound condemning silence as the town's oldest bully was shoved into the back of an unmarked federal vehicle. In the months that followed, Harlan stood trial in a federal courthouse. His defense attorney attempted to argue that he was simply enforcing municipal traffic laws, but the dashcam footage combined with the devastating unified testimony of Lieutenant Thorne, Sheriff Lang, and Officer Pierce dismantled the defense in hours. Presiding federal judge Victor Hale did not mince words during the sentencing. He handed Harlan a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary, forever stripping him of his right to serve in law enforcement or own a firearm. The Fairview Police Department underwent a massive federally mandated overhaul. The corrupt chief of police was forced into early retirement, and Sheriff Lang's office temporarily took over jurisdiction to train a new, accountable generation of officers. Lila Ellison did not let her father's legacy end with a viral video or a courtroom verdict. Using the massive influx of donations that poured in from outraged citizens across the country, she established the Marcus Ellison Veteran Relief Foundation. The charity provided legal aid, housing assistance, and mental health resources to marginalized veterans returning home to communities that failed to support them. Every year on the anniversary of Marcus's funeral, Lieutenant Elias Thorne and the surviving members of the 1st Cavalry returned to Willow Creek Cemetery. They didn't come with sirens or flashing lights. They came quietly, carrying fresh flowers and cold beers, sitting by the edge of the pond to tell stories about a man who walked through hell to save his brothers. Marcus Ellison had lived his life quietly, asking for nothing and giving everything. But in his final journey, he inadvertently accomplished what he had always wanted for his hometown. He forced the town of Fairview to look in the mirror, to confront its darkest demons, and to finally permanently step out of the shadows and into the light. The roadblock meant to disrespect him became the very catalyst that broke the chains of prejudice in his community forever. If Marcus Ellison's incredible journey and the unshakable loyalty of his brothers in arms moved you, please take a moment to engage with this content. We bring you powerful, true-to-life stories of justice, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of honor every single week. Hit that like button to show your respect for the veterans who never leave a brother behind. Share this story with your friends and family to spread the message that prejudice will never defeat true solidarity. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a heroic story.